If you're enjoying this video, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Share it with your friends, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Every like and subscribe helps the channel grow. My name is Victor Kovalchuk. I'm a park ranger stationed deep in the Boundary Waters wilderness of Minnesota. It's a place where the trees grow so thick you can barely see the sky, and the lakes are carved by glaciers that left their mark thousands of years ago. In winter, it's a frozen hell. 20 hours of darkness, temperatures so cold they bite through your bones, and storms that can bury everything in sight. I've lived here for years now, alone with the wilderness. People don't understand why I'd choose this life, but I trust these woods more than I trust people. Maybe it's because I've seen what people can do, what monsters they can become. I grew up in the Soviet Union during Stalin's purges. My family didn't make it out alive, but I did. Barely. And then there was the Korean War. Let's just say I've seen enough blood to last 10 lifetimes. I don't talk much about my past, but it follows me everywhere. Sometimes when the nights are long and quiet, I hear their voices, my wife, my parents, even the men I fought beside. It's like they're still here whispering inside my head. That's why I drink, not because I enjoy it, but because it keeps the whispers away. A few days ago, my supervisor radioed me about a missing trapper family, parents and 2 kids, who hadn't been heard from in weeks. Their cabin is 50 miles from the nearest town, and with the blizzard rolling in, no one else could get out there to check on them. It was up to me. The timing couldn't have been worse. The skies had been acting strange lately. Flashes of green and red light dancing across the horizon at night, brighter than any aurora borealis I'd ever seen before. My compass had been acting up too, spinning wildly like it didn't know which way was north anymore. Old-timers around here say it's a bad omen when the sky bleeds light. They call it windigo winter, a time when something ancient wakes up in these woods. I don't believe in local legends or ghost stories, not really, but something about this felt off from the start. As I packed my gear for the trip, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't just walking into a storm, I was walking into something far worse. The trip to the trapper family's cabin was brutal. The snow came down so hard it felt like the sky was trying to bury me alive. My snowshoes crunched through knee-deep drifts, and the wind howled like a living thing, screaming in my ears. Every step felt heavier than the last, but I kept going. I had a job to do. It took me most of the day to get there. By the time I saw the cabin through the trees, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow. The place looked quiet, too quiet. No smoke from the chimney, no lantern light in the windows, just a dark, lonely shape sitting in the middle of nowhere. I called out as I approached, my voice muffled by the wind. "Hello? Anybody home?" No answer. The door wasn't locked, so I pushed it open and stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was how warm it was, too warm for a place with no fire burning. It felt wrong, like stepping into someone else's dream. The second thing I noticed was the table. Dinner was still sitting there, untouched. A pot of stew, 2 plates of bread, and a small bowl of berries for the kids. The food wasn't frozen or spoiled. It was fresh, like they'd just sat down to eat. But there was no one there. I checked every room in that cabin twice, but found nothing. No signs of a struggle, no blood, no footprints leading away from the house, despite the fresh snow outside. It was like they'd just vanished. That's when I saw it. The teddy bear lying on one of the kids' beds. At first glance, it looked normal, a little worn out, but nothing unusual. Then I picked it up and froze. Its mouth. Its mouth wasn't stitched with thread like most toys. It had teeth, real human teeth, embedded in its fabric like some kind of sick joke. I dropped it and backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. My first thought was that someone had been here, someone dangerous, but there were no signs of forced entry, no tracks outside, nothing made sense. I decided to stay in the cabin for the night. It was too late and too dangerous to head back in the storm. I barricaded the door with furniture and kept my rifle close by, but sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of wood or gust of wind outside made me jump. At some point during the night, I thought I heard something, a faint sound coming from outside. It sounded like a child's voice calling for help. "Daddy, help me." I shot out of bed and grabbed my flashlight, shining it through the frosted window. The beam cut through the darkness, but all I could see was snow falling thick and fast. "Daddy, please." The voice came again, clearer this time, and closer. I threw on my coat and boots and stepped outside, scanning the tree line with my flashlight. "Where are you?" I shouted into the storm. No answer. Then I saw them tiny footprints leading away from the cabin into the woods. They looked fresh, like they'd been made only minutes ago. My gut told me not to follow them, that something wasn't right. But what if one of those kids was still alive? What if they needed me? I followed the tracks for about 50 yards before they just stopped. No sign of where they went, no drag marks or anything, just a perfect line of footprints ending in an empty patch of snow. That's when I heard it again, the voice. But this time it wasn't coming from one direction, it was coming from all around me. "Daddy, help us." I turned in circles, shining my flashlight into the trees, but there was nothing there, just shadows moving with the wind. My hands were shaking as I stumbled back to the cabin and locked myself inside. Whatever this was, it wasn't normal. The next morning, I woke up to silence. The storm had passed, but the air outside was so still it felt unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. I packed my gear quickly, eager to get out of that cabin, but as I stepped outside, something stopped me in my tracks. Lying in the snow just a few feet from the door was a child's teddy bear. The same one I'd seen inside the cabin the night before. The one with human teeth. I knew I'd left it on the bed, but here it was, half buried in the snow, staring up at me with its crooked smile. I didn't touch it, I just stepped around it and started walking back toward the trail. The snow was deep, and every step felt like a struggle, but I kept moving. I told myself I'd done all I could. The family was gone and there were no signs of them anywhere. It wasn't my fault, but then I saw something that made my stomach turn. About 100 yards from the cabin, I came across a deer, or what was left of one. Its body had been gutted clean, its ribs sticking out like broken fingers. But that wasn't the worst part. Its insides, they weren't normal. Instead of organs, its chest cavity was stuffed with pine needles, packed so tightly they looked like they'd been woven together. I crouched down to get a closer look, but as soon as I did, I heard a sound behind me, a low crunching noise like someone stepping on snow. Slowly, I turned around, half expecting to see another animal or maybe even one of the missing family members, but there was nothing there. I stood up quickly and scanned the trees with my rifle raised. My breath came out in short puffs of steam as I tried to steady myself. "Hello?" I called out. No answer. I stayed there for a few minutes, listening to the silence, but nothing else happened. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just my imagination and kept moving. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Everywhere I went, I felt like something was watching me, something just out of sight. The forest seemed darker than usual, even though the storm had cleared, and every now and then, I'd catch glimpses of movement in the corner of my eye, shadows darting between the trees. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. By late afternoon, I decided to set up camp for the night. There was no way I'd make it back to town before dark, and being caught out here without shelter wasn't an option. I found a small clearing near a frozen stream and pitched my tent as quickly as possible. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. My breath froze on my scarf as I huddled inside my sleeping bag, trying to stay warm, but sleep didn't come easily, not with the sounds outside. At first it was just faint whispers, so soft I thought it might be the wind playing tricks on me, but then they grew louder. "Victor." My heart stopped when I heard my name. It wasn't just any voice, it was hers. My wife's voice. "Victor, why did you leave us?" I sat up straight in my sleeping bag, clutching my rifle tightly. "Who's there?" My voice cracked as I shouted into the darkness. No response. I unzipped the tent slowly and shone my flashlight outside. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but snow-covered trees and shadows that seemed to stretch too far. Then something caught my eye. My own footprints in the snow. Except they weren't leading away from camp. They were circling back toward me. It didn't make sense. I hadn't walked anywhere since setting up camp, but there they were, perfect boot prints looping around my tent like someone or something had been watching me all night. I stayed awake until dawn with my rifle in hand, too scared to close my eyes for even a second. When morning finally came, I packed up camp and started walking again, desperate to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever was out there. But no matter how far I went or how fast I walked, that feeling never left me. The feeling that something was following me, waiting for me to slip up. By the third day, I was exhausted. My legs felt like lead, and my head was pounding from lack of sleep. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted. Every time I stopped to catch my breath, I'd hear something, a branch snapping, snow crunching, or that faint whispering just beyond the trees. I kept telling myself it wasn't real, that it was just the stress and cold getting to me. But deep down, I knew better. Something was out there, and it wasn't going to let me leave these woods alive. Around midday, I stumbled across a clearing. At first, I thought it was just another empty patch of forest, but as I got closer, I saw them, the trapper family, or what was left of them. Their bodies had been changed. The parents were stretched out between two trees, their skin pulled so tight it looked like leather. Their arms and legs were twisted into unnatural angles, almost like they'd been tied into knots. The kids were worse. Their small bodies were frozen inside blocks of ice, their faces locked in expressions of pure terror. But that wasn't all. Around them were strange shapes carved into the snow, circles and symbols that didn't make any sense to me. Pine branches were stuck into the ground like markers, and the air smelled sharp and metallic, like blood mixed with frost. I wanted to run. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get out of there, but my feet wouldn't move. I just stood there, staring at the horror in front of me. And then I heard it, a low growl so deep it seemed to rumble through the ground beneath me. Slowly, I turned around, and that's when I saw it for the first time. It was tall, at least 9 feet. Its body impossibly thin but somehow strong-looking at the same time. Its skin was pale and almost translucent, like frost-covered glass. Through it, I could see what looked like frozen organs, lungs that didn't breathe and a heart that didn't beat. Its head was a deer skull with empty black sockets for eyes and antlers that stretched out like jagged branches. It didn't move right away. It just stood there at the edge of the clearing, watching me. But then it opened its mouth, or what should have been its mouth, and spoke. Victor. The voice wasn't its own. It was my mother's voice. The same voice I hadn't heard since she died all those years ago. Victor. Why did you leave us? I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, like someone had wrapped a rope around my lungs and pulled hard. Stay back, I shouted, raising my rifle with shaking hands. The creature tilted its head slightly, almost like it was curious about me. Then it stepped forward, slowly at first, but with a deliberate purpose that made my stomach churn. I fired a shot straight at its chest. The sound echoed through the trees like thunder, but when the smoke cleared, the thing was still standing there, completely unharmed. It let out a sound then, a horrible screeching noise that made my ears ring and my vision blur. Before I could fire again, it lunged at me with impossible speed. I barely managed to dive out of the way as its clawed hand swiped through the air, where I'd been standing a second earlier. Scrambling to my feet, I ran as fast as I could back into the woods, not daring to look back. The thing didn't chase me, not right away, but I could feel its presence behind me, stalking me like a predator playing with its prey. By nightfall, I found myself near an old ice fishing hut by one of the frozen lakes. It wasn't much, a small wooden shack barely big enough for one person, but it was shelter. I barricaded myself inside with whatever I could find, broken chairs, old fishing gear, and tried to catch my breath. That's when Lincoln showed up. Lincoln was another ranger who worked in these parts, a big guy with a loud laugh who always had a story to tell. Seeing him standing outside the hut felt like a miracle. Victor, you okay in there? He called out over the wind. I opened the door just enough to let him in before slamming it shut again. Lincoln, I gasped. There's something out there, something not human. He looked at me strangely, but nodded. I know, he said quietly. For a moment, his words didn't register. What do you mean, you know? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled off his gloves and held his hands over the small heater in the corner of the hut. That's when I noticed something off about him. His skin looked pale, too pale, and his breath didn't fog up in the freezing air like mine did. Lincoln. My voice cracked as dread crept up my spine. How long have you been out here? He turned to look at me then, and his eyes, they weren't right anymore. They were milky white, like ice had formed over them from the inside out. "Long enough," he said in a voice that wasn't his own, a voice that sounded eerily familiar, like mine. I stared at Lincoln, my heart pounding harder than it ever had before. His pale skin, his milky white eyes, the way his breath didn't fog in the freezing air, it all clicked in that moment. Lincoln wasn't alive. He hadn't been for a while. What are you?" I whispered, gripping my rifle tighter. He tilted his head just like the creature had done in the clearing. Then he smiled, a slow, unnatural grin that stretched too wide across his face. "You already know," he said, but it wasn't his voice anymore. It was my wife's voice again. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the broken chair behind me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Lincoln, or whatever was inside him, took a step closer, his movements jerky and wrong, like a puppet being yanked on strings. "You can't run," he said, this time in my mother's voice. "You can't hide." I raised my rifle and aimed it straight at his chest. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice shaking. He didn't stop. I fired once, the shot deafening in the small hut. Lincoln's body jerked backward and collapsed onto the floor, motionless. For a moment, I thought it was over, that whatever had taken him was gone, but then his body started to move again. Slowly, impossibly, he got back up. The bullet hole in his chest didn't bleed. It just oozed something black and thick like tar. His head snapped toward me, and his mouth opened wide enough to show rows of jagged teeth that hadn't been there before. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I grabbed my pack and bolted out of the hut into the freezing night. The wind hit me like a wall as I ran across the frozen lake outside. The ice beneath my feet groaned and cracked with every step, but I didn't stop. Behind me, I could hear Lincoln, or whatever he'd become, following me. "Victor." The voices called out again, louder this time. My wife's voice, my mother's, even my own voice echoed through the darkness. I knew I couldn't outrun it forever. My legs were giving out, and the cold was biting deeper into my skin with every passing second. Then I remembered something from the Ojibwe stories I'd heard growing up. The Wendigo couldn't cross running water where sacred rituals had been performed. The frozen lake wasn't running water, but maybe it could still work. Desperate. I stopped in the middle of the ice and turned to face him. Lincoln's body was barely recognizable now. His skin had turned gray and cracked like old bark, and his eyes glowed faintly in the dark. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the one thing that mattered most to me, the bracelet made from my wife's hair. It was all I had left of her, and all I could think to use. "Help me," I whispered under my breath as I held it tightly in my hand. "Please." The wind around me seemed to shift then, growing stronger but warmer somehow, like a presence was wrapping itself around me. Lincoln, or the Wendigo, lunged toward me with an ear-piercing screech, just as I slammed my boot down hard on the ice beneath us. The crack spread quickly, a jagged line racing outward until it reached him. The ice gave way with a thunderous roar, swallowing him whole into the freezing water below. For a moment, everything went silent except for the sound of my own ragged breathing. Then I felt it, the ice beneath me starting to give way too. I scrambled backward just in time as another section of ice collapsed into the water where I'd been standing moments before. Somehow, by some miracle, I made it back to solid ground before everything fell apart. By the time I reached safety back in town days later, no one believed what had happened out there. Not really. They chalked it up to exhaustion or hallucinations from the cold. But I knew better. Even now, weeks later, something doesn't feel right. My appetite has changed. I'm always hungry no matter how much I eat, and sometimes when I look at my reflection in the mirror, my eyes don't look like mine anymore. They're starting to turn milky white. And late at night, when everything is quiet, I swear I can hear whispers calling my name from deep within the woods. My name is Eleanor Mitchell, but most people just call me Ellie. I'm 35 years old, and I work as a park ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. It's a beautiful place, ancient forests, rolling hills and valleys that feel like they've been untouched for centuries. but it's also a place that holds secrets, things you can't explain no matter how hard you try. I wasn't always a park ranger. Before this, I was a nurse in Vietnam. I saw things there that no one should ever have to see. People dying in my arms, screaming for their mothers. The smell of blood and smoke. It stays with you even when you think you've left it behind. When I came back home, I couldn't handle the noise of the city or the stares of people who didn't understand what I'd been through. So, I came here to the mountains to heal, or at least that's what I told myself. The truth is, I'm still haunted by the war. Some nights, I wake up drenched in sweat, hearing voices of soldiers I couldn't save. To calm myself down, I play a flute my grandfather made for me years ago. He was Cherokee, and he told me music could chase away bad spirits. I don't know if that's true, but it helps me breathe when the memories get too heavy. A few weeks ago, something strange started happening in the park. Hikers began reporting weird things. Stones that seemed to move on their own and patches of fog that didn't behave like normal fog. Some even claimed they lost hours of time without realizing it. At first, we thought it was just people getting spooked by the weather or their own imaginations running wild. But then more reports came in, too many to ignore. That's when my supervisor asked me to check it out. "Ellie," he said, "you're good at keeping your head in strange situations." What he didn't say, but we both knew, was that with all the storms recently washing out roads and damaging our radio system, no one else wanted to go out there alone. So, early one morning, I packed my gear, first aid supplies, a compass, some food and water, and set off toward the Appalachian Trail where most of the reports were coming from. The fog was thicker than usual that day, clinging to everything like a wet blanket. It was so quiet you could hear your own heartbeat if you stood still long enough. I told myself it was just another assignment, just another day in the woods. But deep down, I had this feeling like something was watching me. The fog didn't lift as I hiked deeper into the forest. If anything, it got worse. It wasn't like normal fog that rolls in and out with the wind. This fog seemed alive somehow, like it was moving against the breeze, wrapping itself around the trees and swallowing sound. I couldn't even hear birds or insects anymore. Just my boots crunching on the trail and my breathing. About an hour in, I found something strange near the ranger station. There was a circle of stones perfectly round laid out on the ground. They hadn't been there the day before, and no one had reported seeing them either. The stones weren't big, maybe the size of my fist, but they were smooth, like river rocks, even though there wasn't any water nearby. I crouched down to get a closer look, but when I reached out to touch one, a chill ran down my spine. It wasn't cold outside, not for spring, but those stones felt like ice. I stood up quickly and looked around. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small in the thick fog. No answer, just silence. I kept walking, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling, but as I went farther along the trail, things got stranger. First, I found a deer frozen in place, not just standing still, but turned to stone. Its body was gray and rough, like granite, but its face was twisted in fear, its legs mid-stride like it had been running from something. My stomach dropped when I saw it. What could do this? I whispered to myself. I took a few photos with my camera and marked the spot on my map before moving on. But the farther I went, the more unsettling things became. My watch started acting up. It was running backwards somehow, and my compass needle spun wildly, no matter which direction I faced. It didn't make sense. These were tools I'd relied on for years in the wilderness. Then there were the photographs. When I stopped to check them later that afternoon, something was off. The pictures of the deer looked normal enough, but others, the ones of trees and trails, had figures in them that hadn't been there when I took them. Shadowy shapes standing in the fog, watching me. I told myself it was just a trick of the light or maybe dirt on the lens. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. By sunset, I reached a clearing near an old burial mound, a place marked on some of our maps as sacred Cherokee land. The fog seemed thicker here, pressing against me like invisible hands trying to push me away. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold: footprints in the dirt. They were mine. But here's the thing. I hadn't been to this spot before. Not today or ever. I stared at those footprints for what felt like forever before following them cautiously toward the mound. They led right up to its edge and stopped abruptly, as if whoever made them had disappeared into thin air. That night, as I set up camp nearby, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me from just beyond the fog. That night, I couldn't sleep. The fog seemed to press closer, curling around my tent like it was trying to get inside. Every little sound made me jump. A twig snapping, the rustle of leaves, but the worst part was the silence. There were no birds, no insects, nothing, just me and the fog. I kept my flashlight close and my flute even closer. I don't know why, but holding it made me feel safer. My grandfather always said it could protect me from bad spirits. Maybe that was just a story, but out here, surrounded by this unnatural quiet, I was willing to believe anything. Around midnight, I heard something outside. It wasn't loud, just a faint scraping sound, like rocks being dragged across the ground. My heart started pounding as I unzipped the tent and shined my flashlight into the fog. At first, I didn't see anything, just trees and mist. But then I noticed something near the edge of the clearing, a pile of stones that hadn't been there before. They were stacked neatly, almost like a cairn, but taller than any I'd seen on hiking trails. The stones seemed to shimmer in the beam of my flashlight, and for a moment I thought I saw them move. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat. The air felt heavier with every step, like it was pushing back against me. When I was just a few feet away, the stones shifted again. This time unmistakably. They weren't just moving, they were assembling themselves. Piece by piece, they stacked higher until they formed a shape. A humanoid figure made entirely of stone. Its face wasn't really a face at all, just patches of moss and lichen that shifted as if they were alive. And its eyes were empty voids that seemed to pull in all the light around them. I froze, unable to move or even breathe as it turned toward me. The fog thickened around its body like it was part of the creature itself. It didn't make a sound, not at first, but then it raised one arm and pointed directly at me. That's when I felt it. The cold creeping up my legs like icy fingers wrapping around my skin. I looked down and saw that the ground beneath me was changing, turning gray and rough like stone. Panicking, I stumbled backward and fell hard onto the dirt. The cold stopped immediately, but my legs felt numb. The creature didn't follow me right away. Instead, it seemed to dissolve into the fog, its body breaking apart into smaller stones that scattered across the clearing. I scrambled back to my tent and zipped myself inside like that would somehow keep me safe. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold onto my flashlight. What had I just seen? Was it real, or was I losing my mind? But then I remembered the deer, the way it had been frozen mid-stride, and those footprints leading to the burial mound. This wasn't just some trick of the light or my imagination running wild. Something was out here with me. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. My body was sore, my head was pounding, and the fog hadn't lifted. It was thicker now, so dense I could barely see a few feet in front of me. I packed up my tent quickly, my hands shaking as I tried to focus on what to do next. I couldn't stay here, not after what I'd seen last night. I decided to head back toward the ranger station, but as I started walking, I noticed something strange. My footprints from yesterday were gone. The dirt was smooth, like no one had ever walked there. It didn't make sense. My heart sank as I realized that whatever was out here wasn't just following me, it was erasing my tracks. I kept moving, trying to stay calm, but the fog seemed to grow heavier with every step. The silence was unbearable. I couldn't hear anything, not even my own footsteps anymore. It felt like the forest itself had disappeared, leaving me in some endless void. That seps when I saw them, the search team. 3 figures emerged from the fog ahead of me, wearing park ranger uniforms and carrying flashlights. Relief washed over me as I hurried toward them. "Hey," I called out, my voice breaking with emotion. "I am so glad you stir here." But as I got closer, something felt wrong. Their movements were stiff, unnatural, like puppets being pulled by invisible strings. And their faces weren't right. They looked almost human, but not quite, like stone statues trying to mimic expressions. Then one of them spoke. Ellie. It said in a voice that wasn't its own, a voice I recognized immediately. It was the voice of a soldier from Vietnam, a man who had died in my arms years ago. Ellie. Another one said, its voice different but equally familiar, a nurse who had been killed during an attack on our field hospital. I stumbled backward, my chest tightening as the memories flooded back. The screams, the blood, the helplessness of watching people die while I could do nothing to save them. No, I whispered, shaking my head. You said are not real. The figures stepped closer, their stone-like faces twisting into expressions of pain and anger. You left us, one of them said. You survived when we didn't step. I turned and ran as fast as I could, my legs burning with every step. But no matter how far I went, the voices followed me, echoing through the fog like they were inside my head. Eventually, I reached the burial mound again, the same place where my footprints had led yesterday. The fog seemed to swirl around it like a living thing, pulling me closer even though every instinct told me to run. And then it appeared, the creature from last night. It rose from the ground in front of the mound, its stone body assembling itself piece by piece until it towered over me. This time it didn't dissolve into the fog or point at me silently. Instead, it spoke not in words but in sounds that made my ears ache and my head spin. The ground beneath me started to change again, gray and rough like stone, and this time it spread faster than before. My boots began turning solid, trapping me in place. Desperate, I grabbed my flute and started playing the first melody that came to mind, a tune my grandfather had taught me when I was a child. The notes cut through the fog like sunlight piercing clouds, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. The creature froze mid-motion, its stone body vibrating violently, as if it were struggling against the sound. But then it started moving again, slowly at first but faster with each passing second. That's when Thomas Running Wolf appeared out of nowhere. He was a local guide who had helped me on previous assignments, a man who knew these mountains better than anyone else. But something was wrong with him now. His skin looked pale and cracked like stones spreading through his body from the inside out. I'll stop it, he said weakly, his voice barely audible over the sound of my flute. Before I could stop him or even understand what he meant, Thomas charged at the creature with all his strength. His body shattered against it like glass breaking into a million pieces, stone fragments flying everywhere as both he and the creature collapsed into rubble. The fog suddenly lifted as thunder rumbled in the distance and rain began pouring down in sheets. The water washed away everything, the stones, the footprints, until there was nothing left but mud and silence. I stood there for what felt like hours before finally forcing myself to move. My legs felt weak, but somehow still worked despite everything that had happened. I survived, but not without scars. I don't remember how I made it back to the ranger station that day. My legs felt like they were moving on their own, one step at a time through the rain-soaked forest. The fog was finally gone, but the silence lingered. No birds, no wind, no sound except for the squelching of my boots in the mud. When I reached the station, it felt like I'd been gone for weeks instead of just a day. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely unlock the door. Once inside, I collapsed onto a chair and stared at the wall, trying to process everything that had happened. Thomas Running Wolf was gone. The creature, the thing made of stones and fog, was gone too. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that somehow it was still out there, waiting. I looked down at my hands and gasped. They were wrinkled, like they belonged to someone much older than me. My reflection in the station's small mirror confirmed what I feared. My hair was almost completely gray now, and deep lines creased my face. It was as if I had aged decades overnight. I tried to tell myself it was just exhaustion or stress playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever that creature was, whatever it had done to me, it had left its mark. The next few days passed in a blur. The storms finally cleared, and other rangers returned to the park. I told them about Thomas and what had happened in the woods, but I left out most of the details. Who would believe me if I said a creature made of stones and fog had tried to turn me into one of its victims? They'd think I'd lost my mind. But something strange started happening after that. Visitors to the park began reporting sightings of a woman with gray hair playing a flute near stone formations deep in the forest. Some said she seemed kind and peaceful. Others claimed she disappeared into thin air when they tried to approach her. At first, I thought they were just seeing things, mistaking shadows for people, or hearing echoes in the wind. But then one day, while reviewing some trail camera footage from an area near the burial mound, I saw her too. It was me. Or at least, it looked like me. The woman on the screen had my face, older now with gray hair, but she moved in ways that didn't seem entirely human. She walked through dense fog without hesitation, her figure fading in and out like she was part of it. I don't know what's real anymore. Am I still me, or did part of me stay behind in those woods with that creature? All I know is this: something changed that day in the forest, and no matter how far I run or how hard I try to forget, it will always be with me. Even now, when I close my eyes at night, I can still hear the sound of stones scraping together and feel the cold creeping up my legs. My name is Marcus Thornton. I'm a park ranger stationed at the Okefenokee Swamp in Georgia. It's not exactly the kind of job I imagined for myself when I was younger. Back then, I was a marine biologist, diving into deep-sea trenches and studying creatures most people couldn't even dream of. But that all ended when I made discoveries that no one wanted to believe. They called me crazy, said my findings were impossible, and eventually I was dismissed from my career. Now, I spend my days patrolling this swamp, a place that feels just as mysterious as the ocean depths I used to explore. The Okefenokee isn't like any other swamp. It's ancient, with trees so old they look like they've been here since the beginning of time. The water is dark, almost black, stained by tannins from the cypress trees. On calm days, it's like a mirror reflecting the sky, but when you look closer, it feels like it's hiding something beneath its surface. Floating peat islands drift aimlessly, and the air smells of damp earth and decay. It's quiet here, too quiet sometimes, and the isolation can get to you. Lately, things have been strange. The swamp is going through an unprecedented drought, and water levels are dropping fast. Areas that have been submerged for centuries are suddenly exposed, muddy patches of land and ancient roots sticking out like skeletal fingers. The locals say this isn't just a natural event, they call it the veil pulling back. There's an old Gullah Geechee legend about creatures that live deep in the swamp, hidden from sight until the waters recede. They call them dwellers in the deep, but most people brush it off as folklore. I wish I could say I didn't believe in those stories, but after everything I've seen in my life, I know better than to dismiss what others fear. This week, I've been assigned to investigate a series of mass fish die-offs. The EPA sent 2 inspectors out here last week to look into it, but they haven't returned. Their boat was found abandoned near one of the deeper channels, but there was no sign of them, no footprints on the shore, no clues about where they went. It's my job to figure out what happened and report back to my supervisor. I packed my gear this morning: water samples kits, sonar equipment, and my camera, the same one I used during my deep-sea expeditions years ago. And then there's my specimen jar. It's been with me ever since my career fell apart. Inside is a small creature preserved in alcohol, a creature I found near an ocean trench that shouldn't exist according to science. Its translucent body and tiny appendages remind me that there's so much we don't understand about life on this planet. As I step into my boat and push off into the labyrinth of waterways, I can't shake the feeling that this assignment is going to be different from anything I've faced before. The swamp feels alive in a way that's hard to explain, like it's watching me or waiting for something. But then again, maybe it's just my imagination. The swamp was quiet as I paddled deeper into its heart. Too quiet. Normally you'd hear frogs croaking, insects buzzing, or the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. But today, there was nothing, just the sound of my paddle cutting through the still, black water. It put me on edge, but I told myself it was just the drought messing with the ecosystem. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I started my investigation near the area where the EPA inspector's boat had been found. The boat itself was still there, tied to a tree, but it didn't look like it had been touched since they disappeared. The hull was intact, no signs of damage, but when I peered inside, my stomach turned. The interior was melted. The seats, the dashboard, even the metal parts looked like they'd been eaten away by some kind of acid. I'd never seen anything like it. I took a few photos and jotted down notes in my logbook. Interior of boat corroded, unknown cause. No signs of struggle or human remains. It felt clinical, writing it down like that, but I needed to stay focused. Whatever happened here, it wasn't normal. As I moved further into the swamp, I started noticing other strange things. Dead fish floated on the surface in clusters, their bodies bloated and discolored. Some of them had extra eyes or strange growths on their fins, mutations that didn't make any sense. I scooped one up with my net and examined it closely. Its skin was slimy and cold, and when I turned it over, I saw what looked like tiny fingers forming where its pectoral fins should have been. What the hell is going on here? I muttered to myself. I took a water sample from the area and stored it in one of my vials. The water looked normal at first glance, but when I held it up to the light, I noticed tiny organisms swimming inside, too small to see clearly without a microscope, but definitely alive. They moved in jerky, unnatural patterns that made my skin crawl. As the day went on, the swamp seemed to grow darker, even though the sun was still high in the sky. The tannic water reflected everything around me like a black mirror, making it hard to tell where the swamp ended and the sky began. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a ripple in the water or a shadow darting between the trees, but whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. By late afternoon, I decided to test my sonar equipment near one of the deeper channels. If there was something unusual in this part of the swamp, some kind of underwater structure or geological anomaly, it might explain what was happening. I lowered the sonar into the water and waited as it sent out its signals. At first, everything seemed normal, just flat readings showing mud and peat below the surface. But then something changed. The screen flickered for a moment before displaying a massive structure beneath me, something far larger than any tree root or rock formation could be. It stretched across nearly half a mile and seemed to have sharp edges, almost like walls or pillars. I stared at the screen in disbelief. "That can't be right," I whispered. I adjusted the settings and ran another scan, but this time nothing showed up. The structure was gone as if it had never been there in the first place. A sudden splash behind me made me jump. I spun around just in time to see ripples spreading across the water's surface, but whatever caused them was already gone. My heart pounded as I scanned the area with my flashlight, but all I saw were trees and shadows. I told myself it was probably just an alligator or a big fish, something normal, but deep down I knew better. As night began to fall, I decided to head back to camp. The swamp felt different now, heavier somehow, and every instinct told me to leave while I still could. But this was just the beginning. The next morning, I woke up to an unsettling silence. The swamp, which was usually alive with the sounds of birds and insects at dawn, was completely still. Even the air felt different, thicker, like it was harder to breathe. I packed my gear quickly, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. There was still so much I needed to figure out. I decided to start by analyzing the water sample I'd collected the day before. Using a portable microscope from my kit, I placed a drop of the swamp water on a slide and adjusted the focus. What I saw made my stomach churn. The tiny organisms I'd noticed earlier weren't just swimming, they were moving in patterns, almost like they were working together. They pulsed and shifted in unison, forming shapes that looked disturbingly deliberate. It wasn't random, it was coordinated. I leaned back and rubbed my eyes, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Microorganisms don't behave like that. Not naturally, anyway. As I packed up my equipment, I noticed something odd about my hands. The skin between my fingers looked different. It wasn't exactly webbing, but it felt tighter, like it was stretching in a way it shouldn't. I brushed it off as dehydration or stress and decided to keep moving. By midday, I reached a part of the swamp that had been completely exposed by the drought. The ground was cracked and dry, with tree roots jutting out like twisted bones. In the middle of this barren area stood something that didn't belong. a massive stone structure covered in strange carvings. It looked ancient, older than anything I'd ever seen in this region. I approached cautiously, my boots sinking into the soft mud with every step. The carvings on the stone were intricate, depicting creatures that didn't look entirely human or entirely animal. Some had elongated limbs and bulbous eyes, others looked like they were half fish, half man. As I ran my fingers over the carvings, a chill ran down my spine. They reminded me of something from my past. That's when it hit me. These symbols were almost identical to ones I'd seen during my deep-sea expeditions years ago. Back then, I'd found similar markings on rocks near an underwater trench thousands of miles away from here. At the time, no one believed me when I suggested they might be evidence of an ancient civilization. But now I wasn't so sure they were wrong to doubt me. As I stood there, staring at the carvings, a low hum filled the air. It wasn't loud. It was more like a vibration that I could feel in my chest. The ground beneath me seemed to pulse in time with the sound, and for a moment I thought I saw the carvings move just slightly, like they were alive. I stumbled back, heart racing. "This can't be real," I whispered. Before I could process what was happening, a shadow passed over me. Looking up, I saw a flock of birds flying overhead, but something about them wasn't right. Their wings moved awkwardly, like they weren't used to flying, and their bodies seemed wrong, misshapen, twisted. I watched as they disappeared into the distance, leaving behind an eerie silence once again. By late afternoon, things only got worse. While paddling through one of the deeper channels, I noticed the water behaving strangely. It rippled against the current, as if being pulled by an invisible force. Then it started flowing upward, climbing up tree trunks and dripping back down like rain in reverse. I froze in place, gripping my paddle tightly as my boat rocked beneath me. My mind raced for an explanation, some kind of natural phenomenon or optical illusion, but nothing made sense. That's when Jefferson showed up. Jefferson was a local fishing guide who knew these waters better than anyone else. He'd been helping me navigate the swamp since this whole investigation started. But today his skin was pale and clammy, and there were strange marks on his neck, thin slits that almost looked like gills. "You shouldn't be here," he said in a voice that didn't sound like his own. It was deeper somehow, almost guttural. "What happened to you?" I asked cautiously. Jefferson didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared at me with wide eyes that seemed too bright for his face. "They're waking up," he finally said. "The drought, it's pulling back the veil." Before I could ask him what he meant, he turned and walked into the water without hesitation, like it was calling him home. I called after him, but he didn't respond. He just kept walking until he disappeared beneath the surface. Something deep inside me told me to leave, to get out of this swamp while I still could, but another part of me needed answers, needed to know what was really happening here. And so, against all logic and reason, I stayed. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the swamp was swallowed by darkness. I sat in my boat, staring at the water, trying to make sense of everything I'd seen. Jefferson's words echoed in my mind. "They're waking up. The drought, it's pulling back the veil." What did he mean? And why did he walk into the water like that, as if he belonged there? I didn't have answers, but I knew one thing for sure. Something was alive in this swamp. Something ancient. Something dangerous. I decided to follow the sonar readings from earlier, hoping they would lead me to whatever was hiding beneath the peak. As I paddled deeper into the labyrinth of waterways, the air grew heavier, almost suffocating. The water around me seemed to glow faintly, like it was alive with energy. Every ripple felt deliberate, like it was guiding me somewhere. After what felt like hours, I reached a narrow channel surrounded by towering cypress trees. The water here was different, thicker, almost oily, and it smelled sharp, like chemicals mixed with decay. My boat rocked gently as I drifted forward, and that's when I saw it. At first, it looked like a cluster of smaller creatures, long eel-like shapes swimming just below the surface. But as they moved closer together, they began to merge into something larger. Their translucent bodies fused seamlessly, forming a massive entity that rose slowly from the depths. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Its skin was pale and slimy, stretched tight over a body that seemed both amphibious and alien. Its head resembled that of a salamander, but with sharp teeth and glowing eyes that pulsed with an unnatural light. Dangling from its face were tendrils that glowed faintly like deep-sea anglerfish lures. But what truly horrified me were the parasites inside its body, hundreds of smaller organisms swimming beneath its translucent skin. They moved in perfect synchronization, their shapes shifting and pulsing as if they were part of a hive mind. I froze in place, unable to move or even breathe, as the creature stared at me with those glowing eyes. It wasn't just looking at me, it was studying me. And then it spoke. Not with words, but with thoughts. Images flashed through my mind, visions of deep-sea trenches and ancient civilizations buried beneath the waves. I saw creatures like this one emerging from the depths long before humans walked the earth. They were older than time itself, waiting patiently for moments like this when nature pulled back its veil. "You were chosen," the voice whispered in my head. I shook my head violently, trying to block out its words. "No," I muttered under my breath. "This isn't set real." But it was real, too real. The creature began to move closer, its massive body displacing the water around my boat. The air grew colder as it loomed over me, its tendrils reaching out like fingers searching for prey. Desperate to escape, I grabbed my camera, the one piece of equipment I trusted more than anything else, and adjusted its flash settings. Years ago during my deep-sea expeditions, I discovered that certain wavelengths of ultraviolet light could disrupt aquatic predators' neural networks temporarily. It was a long shot, but it was all I had. I pointed the camera at the creature and fired the flash. The effect was immediate. The smaller parasites inside its body began to writhe and pulse erratically, breaking their perfect synchronization. The creature let out a deafening roar, a sound so low and guttural that it vibrated through my chest and recoiled slightly. But it wasn't stead enough to stop it completely. The swamp itself seemed to turn against me as methane pockets ignited spontaneously around me, creating bursts of flame that lit up the darkness. My boat rocked violently as whirlpools formed in the water, threatening to pull me under. And then Jefferson appeared again. He wasn't human anymore, not fully. His skin had turned pale and slimy like the creature's, and gill-like slits on his neck opened and closed as he breathed. But his eyes still held some trace of humanity. "You have to go," he said in that guttural voice. "It sets too late for me." Before I could respond, Jefferson turned toward the creature and lunged at it with unnatural strength, tearing at its tendrils with his bare hands. The creature roared again, thrashing wildly as Jefferson fought to hold it back. It was my chance to escape. I paddled furiously through the chaos, dodging flames and whirlpools as I made my way back towards safety. My heart raced with every stroke of the paddle, but I didn't dare look back, not until I reached solid ground. When I finally dragged myself onto shore, gasping for air, I turned around just in time to see Jefferson disappear beneath the water along with the creature. The swamp fell silent once again. I sat on the shore, drenched and shaking, staring out at the swamp. The water was calm now, as if nothing had happened. The creature was gone, and Jefferson had sacrificed himself to save me. I didn't know what to feel. Grief? Guilt? Relief? All I knew was that I'd survived something I couldn't explain, something I wasn't sure anyone would believe. I checked my camera, hoping the photos I'd taken would prove what I saw. The memory card was intact, but when I tried to review the images, the screen flickered and went black. My heart sank. All the evidence was gone. I stumbled back to camp as the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees. The swamp looked almost peaceful in the morning light, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, waiting for me to leave. Back at my cabin, I tried to make sense of everything. I wrote down every detail in my logbook: the mutated fish, the carvings on the stone structure, Jefferson's transformation, and the creature itself. But no matter how hard I tried to describe it, words felt inadequate. How do you explain something that defies logic? Something that feels like it shouldn't exist? As I packed my things to leave, I noticed something strange about my hands again. The skin between my fingers had tightened even more, forming faint webbing that hadn't been there before. My pulse quickened as I examined myself in the mirror. My eyes looked different too, polar, almost glowing in the dim light. No, I whispered to myself. This can't be happening, but it was happening. Whatever was in that swamp, whatever lived beneath its surface, it had left its mark on me. I reported everything to my supervisor and handed over my logbook before heading back home. A week later, I received a call saying the EPA had dropped all investigations into the swamp. No explanation was given. They just said it wasn't worth pursuing anymore. Then came the lab accident. The water samples I'd collected were sent to a research facility for analysis, but before any results could be shared, a fire broke out and destroyed everything, including my logbook and camera equipment. It felt deliberate, like someone or something wanted to erase any trace of what happened. I tried to move on with my life after that, but it wasn't easy. The nightmares started almost immediately, visions of glowing eyes and translucent skin, of tendrils reaching out for me in the darkness. Sometimes I'd wake up gasping for air, feeling like I was drowning even though I was safe in bed. And then there were the changes. The webbing between my fingers grew thicker over time, and my eyesight became sharper in low light but weaker in bright conditions. My skin felt colder to the touch, and sometimes when I swam in the ocean, which I did more often now, I felt an overwhelming sense of belonging. It wasn't long before I stopped fighting it altogether. The last time anyone saw me was at a beach near Savannah. Witnesses said they saw me walking into the ocean at sunrise with nothing but a small bag slung over my shoulder. They said I didn't hesitate or look back. I just kept walking until the water swallowed me whole. I don't know where I am now or what's become of me. All I know is that something is calling me, something deep beneath the surface, and I can't resist anymore. The swamp changed me forever, and maybe that's exactly what it wanted. My name is Gabriel Martinez. I'm 36 years old and I work as a park ranger at Arches National Park in Utah. It's a quiet job far away from the noise of the city, surrounded by rust-colored sandstone arches, slot canyons, and endless stretches of desert. Most people think it's boring out here, but I like the peace. It gives me time to think, or at least it used to. I wasn't always a park ranger. Before this, I was an anthropologist specializing in pre-Columbian cultures. I spent years chasing answers about ancient civilizations, digging into mysteries that most people don't even know exist. But one discovery changed everything for me. It was something that didn't fit, evidence that contradicted everything we thought we knew about history. When I tried to share it, my career fell apart. People called me crazy. So I left academia and came here, hoping to leave all that behind. But the desert has its own secrets. Arches National Park isn't just a place of beauty, it's also a place of stories. The Navajo and Ute tribes speak of Skinwalkers, beings that can take on the shape of animals or humans, and those who wait in stone. Ancient spirits awakened when sacred sites are disturbed. At first I thought these were just legends passed down through generations, stories meant to scare people or teach lessons about respecting nature. But lately, I'm not so sure. The park has been strange lately. The drought has lasted longer than anyone expected, and now there are sudden lightning storms without rain. Dust storms have started rolling in, carrying fine red particles that coat everything like blood. Even the animals are acting weird. Robins flying in perfect circles above the arches and coyotes standing still for hours as if they're watching something invisible. And then there's the land itself. There are parts of this park so remote that fewer than 5 people visit them in a year. Some areas don't even have radio signals, dead zones where you're completely cut off from the outside world. That's where my latest assignment is taking me, a newly discovered rock art site deep in the canyons. They say someone vandalized it, but when I saw the photos, it didn't look like vandalism to me. The carving showed strange astronomical patterns, stars and constellations that don't match anything in our sky today. Something about it felt wrong. I don't know what I'll find out there, but part of me doesn't want to go alone. I packed my gear early the next morning, a flashlight, a map, extra water bottles, and my old notebook where I jot down anything that feels important. I also took my coyote-shaped stone fetish, the one I've carried since I was a kid. It's smooth and warm to the touch, like it's alive somehow. My grandfather gave it to me when I was little, saying it would protect me. I don't know if I believe that, but it's comforting to have it with me. The hike to the vandalized rock art site was long and quiet. The deeper I went into the park, the more isolated it felt. No tourists, no other rangers, just me and the sound of my boots crunching against the sandstone. The air was dry and heavy, making it hard to breathe. Every now and then I'd hear the cry of a raven or the distant howl of a coyote, but they sounded off, like they were too close or too far at the same time. When I finally reached the site, I froze. The carvings were unlike anything I'd ever seen before. At first glance, they looked like constellations, patterns of stars etched into the stone, but they didn't match any known star maps. There were figures too, tall humanoid shapes with elongated limbs and faces that seemed to shift as you stared at them. It made my skin crawl. I took photos and notes, trying to make sense of it all. The vandalism was strange too. It wasn't spray paint or scratches like you'd expect. It looked like someone had tried to carve over the original designs but gave up halfway through. The marks were jagged and uneven, almost desperate. That's when I noticed something odd. One of the carvings, the one that looked like a spiral, was glowing faintly in the sunlight. It wasn't bright enough to be obvious, but if you tilted your head just right, you could see it shimmer like heat rising off asphalt. I reached out to touch it, but before my fingers made contact, a sudden gust of wind whipped through the canyon, kicking up red dust everywhere. It stunned my eyes and filled my lungs, making me cough so hard I thought I'd pass out. When the dust settled and I opened my eyes again, I gasped. The carving had changed. The spiral was gone, replaced by something new. A figure crouched low with sharp claws and glowing eyes. It hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. I stepped back quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my camera to take another photo. But when I looked at the screen later, nothing had changed in the picture. The carving still showed the spiral. That night at camp, things got worse. It started small. My flashlight flickered even though the batteries were fresh. My water bottle tipped over on its own when there was no wind or movement around me. Then came the animals. Ravens appeared out of nowhere, circling above my tent in perfect geometric patterns like they were tracing invisible shapes in the sky. Coyotes stood on ridges nearby, watching me silently with glowing eyes that reflected the moonlight. One of them stood upright on two legs for a few seconds before dropping back down on all fours and disappearing into the darkness. I tried to ignore them. I told myself it was just fatigue or paranoia, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. The next morning brought more surprises. When I woke up, some of my personal items, my notebook, flashlight, and even my boots, were missing from where I'd left them inside my tent. At first, I thought an animal had gotten in while I was sleeping, but then I found them neatly arranged outside in a circle around a small pile of red stones that hadn't been there before. I stared at the arrangement for what felt like hours before finally gathering everything back up and packing my bag again. As much as I wanted to leave this place behind, something kept pulling me deeper into the canyon. By day 3, even the land itself seemed alive. Rock formations shifted overnight. I swear they weren't in the same places as before, and paths that should have led back to camp twisted into dead ends or loops that brought me right back where I started. Photographs showed things that weren't there when I took them. Shadows with extra limbs or faces peeking out from behind rocks. And then there was my shadow. It moved differently than me sometimes, lagging behind or stretching longer than it should have been, and once it split into two for just a moment before snapping back together again. I don't know why I kept going deeper into the canyon. Part of me wanted to turn back, but something about the carvings and the strange things happening around me felt like they were calling me forward. It was like the desert itself didn't want to let me leave. By the afternoon of day 4, I stumbled upon something that made my stomach twist. Hidden beneath one of the larger arches was an opening, a narrow crack in the ground, just wide enough to squeeze through. It wasn't on any map I'd seen before, and it didn't look natural. The edges of the crack were smooth, like they'd been carved by human hands. I hesitated for a moment, staring into the darkness below, The air coming out of the crack was cold and smelled faintly metallic, like rusted iron. I should have turned back then, but curiosity got the better of me. I tied a rope around a nearby rock, secured my flashlight to my belt, and climbed down. The chamber below was massive, far larger than I expected. My flashlight barely lit up the walls, which were covered in carvings similar to the ones I'd seen earlier. But these were different. They weren't just star patterns or humanoid figures. They showed scenes, battles between strange creatures, people with animal heads performing rituals, and what looked like sacrifices under a blood-red sky. And then I saw them, the bodies. They were perfectly preserved, lying in a circle around a central altar made of black stone. Their skin was missing, but their muscles and bones were intact, almost as if someone had peeled them like fruit. Despite being surrounded by these horrors, I couldn't stop staring at their faces or what was left of them. They weren't just from one time period. Some looked ancient, while others wore modern clothing that couldn't have been more than a few years old. That's when I heard it, a low growl echoing through the chamber. I whipped around, shining my flashlight into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing but shadows dancing on the walls. Then something moved, a shape that didn't belong there. It stepped into the light slowly, its body hunched and twisted like it wasn't used to standing upright. It looked like a coyote at first glance, but its limbs were too long and its eyes glowed like embers in a dying fire. Its skin seemed loose, hanging off its body in patches as if it didn't fit right. And then it did something that made my blood run cold. It stood up on two legs. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight as it let out a sound that was somewhere between a growl and a laugh. More shapes emerged from the shadows behind it. 4 of them, all moving unnaturally fast when I wasn't looking directly at them. I remembered the stories then, the ones about skinwalkers and those who wait in stone. But these weren't just stories anymore. They were real. I backed away slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements. My hand brushed against one of the carvings on the wall, a spiral similar to the one I'd seen before, and for a brief moment it glowed under my touch. The creatures froze mid-step, as if they couldn't come closer while I was near it. That's when I realized something. These things weren't invincible. They had rules, weaknesses, even if I didn't fully understand them yet. I climbed out of the chamber as quickly as I could, my heart racing. The creatures below hadn't followed me, but I could still feel their presence. It was like the air around me had changed. Heavier, colder, and full of something I couldn't see. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew one thing. They weren't going to let me leave easily. By the time I reached my camp, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the canyon walls. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself I'd imagined some of it. But deep down, I knew better. Something was wrong with this place. Something ancient and dangerous. That night, the real nightmare began. It started with the dust storms. Out of nowhere, a gust of wind slammed into my tent, ripping one side open and filling it with red dust. The particles stuck to everything, my skin, my clothes, even my water bottles, and smelled faintly metallic like blood. I stumbled outside to fix the tent when I saw them, shadows moving in the distance. At first, they looked like animals, coyotes or deer, but as they got closer, their shapes shifted. Some stood upright, their limbs too long and thin to be natural. Others crouched low to the ground, crawling toward me like predators stalking prey. My flashlight flickered again, barely illuminating their glowing eyes. I ran back to the tent and zipped it shut, trying to block out the sound of their growls and whispers. But then came the voices. They weren't set loud, just faint murmurs at first, but they sounded familiar. One of them called my name in a voice that sounded exactly like my grandfather Sit's. "Gabriel," it said softly from outside the tent. "Why are you running? Don't sit, you trust me?" I froze. My grandfather had died years ago, but hearing his voice now made my chest tighten with fear and confusion. How could these things know about him? How could they sound so real? The voices didn't stop there. They whispered secrets, things no one else could have known about me, failures from my academic career, arguments with my family, moments of doubt and shame that I'd buried deep inside myself. It felt like they were peeling back layers of my mind, exposing everything I'd tried to forget. When morning came, I thought it was over, but it wasn't. The dust storms had left behind strange patterns in the sand around my camp, spirals and circles that looked eerily similar to the carvings on the canyon walls. My water supply was contaminated too, filled with red sediment that made me feel dizzy and nauseous when I drank it. And then there was Dr. Reed. He was supposed to meet me at the site later that day, a consultant sent by the Park Service to help analyze the carvings, but when he arrived, something was off about him. His movements were stiff, his eyes darting around nervously as if he were looking for something or someone that wasn't there. "I cut myself on one of those carvings," he said casually, when I asked if he was okay. Nothing serious. But as the day went on, his behavior grew stranger. He started mumbling under his breath and staring at the canyon walls for long periods of time without blinking. At one point, he disappeared for nearly an hour without explanation and returned with a distant look in his eyes. That evening, as we sat by the campfire discussing our findings, Reed leaned forward suddenly and grabbed my arm. "You shouldn't have come here," he whispered urgently, his grip tightening until it hurt. "They spar watching us." Before I could respond, he let go and walked away into the darkness without another word. I stayed awake all night after that, listening for any sound that might signal his return, or worse, something else coming for me. By the 5th day, I was barely holding it together. Every step felt heavier, every breath harder, as if the canyon itself was alive and trying to crush me. Dr. Reed hadn't returned, and part of me didn't want to find him. Whatever was happening to him, it wasn't human anymore. I decided to leave that morning, but the canyon had other plans. The trails I'd followed for years were gone, replaced by twisted paths that led deeper into the maze of sandstone walls. My map was useless now, and my compass spun wildly like it couldn't find true north. As I wandered, I noticed something strange. The rock formations were changing again. They weren't just shifting positions, they were taking shapes. Faces carved into the stone stared at me with hollow eyes, and hands seemed to reach out from the walls as if trying to grab me. Then I heard it, a scream so loud it echoed through the canyon like thunder. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely animal either. I froze, gripping my flashlight tightly as shadows began moving around me. They were fast, too fast to follow, and every time I turned my head, they disappeared just out of sight. I stumbled into a narrow slot canyon, hoping it would lead me out, but instead it trapped me. The walls closed in tighter with every step until I could barely move without scraping against the sandstone. That's when they appeared. At first, there was only one. A figure wearing the face of a missing park visitor I'd seen on a flyer months ago. Its skin was stretched tight over its body like a mask, and its eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. Then more came. 5, 10, 20 of them, all wearing faces that didn't belong to them. I backed away slowly, but there was nowhere to go. The canyon walls pressed in closer until I felt like I couldn't breathe. "Gabriel," one of them said in my grandfather Sip's voice, "you can run from us." I knew what they wanted: to take my skin, my face, my life, and I wasn't going to let them have it. In a desperate move, I pulled out the pigments I'd brought with me, the ones used by ancient tribes for rituals, and began painting lines across the ground. Red ochre mixed with my own blood as I worked quickly, drawing spirals and circles based on carvings I'd seen in the chamber below. The creatures hesitated, their glowing eyes flickering as if the symbols confused them. But they didn't stop entirely. They kept moving closer, slower, now, but just as deadly. I realized then that it wasn't enough. I needed something stronger. With trembling hands, I took my coyote-shaped stone fetish and placed it at the center of the circle. It felt warm in my palm, as if it were alive. Then I did something I never thought I'd do. I cut my own hand and let the blood drip onto the stone. The effect was immediate. The creatures screamed, a sound so piercing it felt like knives cutting through my ears, and began dissolving into black smoke that swirled violently around me. The canyon shook as a flash flood roared through, carrying away everything in its path. The smoke, the rocks, even parts of the canyon walls themselves. I collapsed on the ground as water rushed past me, soaking me to the bone but washing away the red dust that had clung to my skin for days. When the floodwaters finally receded, I was left sitting in the mud, drenched and shaking. The canyon was quiet now. Too quiet. The creatures were gone, but their screams still echoed in my mind. It felt like the desert had swallowed them whole, but I knew better. Things like that don't just disappear. I forced myself to stand, my legs weak and trembling. The sun was rising, casting soft light over the canyon walls that had seemed so alive just hours ago. Now they were still, lifeless again, or pretending to be. I made my way back to camp slowly, every step feeling heavier than the last. My gear was soaked, my map ruined, and my water supply contaminated with red sediment that I didn't dare touch. Somehow, though, I felt lucky to be alive. But something wasn't set right. As I packed up my tent and prepared to leave, I caught a glimpse of myself in the cracked mirror I kept in my bag. At first, it looked normal. Just me, tired and worn out from the past few days. But then I noticed something strange. My reflection wasn't moving exactly like me. When I tilted my head to one side, it hesitated for a moment before following, and when I blinked, it didn't blink back right away. I dropped the mirror and stared at my hands, turning them over slowly. That's when I saw it. A small patch of obsidian-like material forming beneath the skin on my palm. It shimmered faintly in the sunlight, just like the carvings on the canyon walls. I don't know what's happening to me now. Maybe I escaped those creatures, or maybe part of them stayed behind. My name is William Rollins, but everyone calls me Bill. I'm a park ranger here at Mammoth Cave National Park in Kentucky. It's a strange job for someone like me, considering I've spent most of my life trying to avoid caves. You see, I used to be a coal miner just like my dad and his dad before him. But after surviving a cave-in years ago that killed half my crew, including my brother, I developed a fear of tight spaces. Claustrophobia, they call it. Funny thing is, I still ended up working underground. Maybe it's because I feel like I owe it to the ones who didn't make it out. Mammoth Cave isn't your average hole in the ground. It's the longest cave system in the world, over 400 miles of mapped passages, and who knows how many more are still hidden. Some folks say it's like an underground maze that's alive, always shifting and changing with every tremor or flood. And lately, there's been plenty of that seismic activity shaking things up, opening new tunnels and collapsing old ones. It keeps us busy, but it also makes the place feel restless. The government has been poking around here too, especially since the Cold War started heating up. They're running secret experiments down in the caves, testing how sound travels through limestone and whether these tunnels could be used as fallout shelters. They don't tell us much, but every now and then we hear strange noises, whispers, echoes that seem to come from nowhere. Local miners have their own stories about the caves. They talk about knockers, mysterious tapping sounds on the walls that show up before disasters strike. Some say they're warnings. Others think they're lures to lead people deeper into danger. I never put much stock in those tales, until now. A few days ago, a tour group reported hearing their names being called from unmapped passages during their visit. At first, we thought it was just echoes bouncing around the limestone walls, or maybe someone playing tricks. But when we checked the area later, we found something strange. Mining equipment from the 1800s sitting in perfect condition, as if someone had just left it there. Now my job is to investigate what's going on down there. I've got a small team with me, a couple of researchers and a graduate student named Palmer who's studying cave acoustics. We're equipped with recording devices, safety lamps, and enough food and water for a few days underground. But as I stand at the entrance to the cave, staring into its yawning darkness, I can't shake the feeling that we're stepping into something far older and far more dangerous than we understand. We started our descent early in the morning. The air inside the cave was cool and damp, with that earthy smell that always reminded me of the mines. I kept my safety lamp close. It's the same one I carried during the cave-in all those years ago. It's old and battered, but it's never let me down. Maybe it's silly, but it feels like a piece of my past that still keeps me safe. Palmer was leading the way, his headlamp bouncing off the limestone walls as he pointed out formations and muttered something about acoustics. The researchers followed behind him, carrying equipment that looked more complicated than anything I'd ever used in my mining days. I brought up the rear, keeping an eye on everyone and making sure we didn't stray too far from the marked paths. In Mammoth Cave, it's easy to get lost, and once you're lost, there's no guarantee you'll be found. At first, everything seemed normal. The tunnels stretched on endlessly, twisting and turning like a labyrinth, carved by time itself. We passed stalactites hanging from the ceiling like frozen icicles and stalagmites rising from the ground like ancient pillars. The only sounds were our footsteps crunching on loose gravel and the occasional drip of water echoing in the distance. But then we started hearing something else. It began as faint tapping noises, so soft you could barely notice them unless you were listening for it. Palmer stopped dead in his tracks when he heard it first. "Do you hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely above a breath. We all froze, straining our ears against the silence. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't loud or fast, just steady enough to make your skin crawl. It sounded like someone tapping a rock against the wall deep inside the cave, far beyond where we were standing. The researchers exchanged nervous glances, but I told myself it was just water dripping or maybe loose rocks settling after one of those tremors we've been having lately. We moved deeper into the cave system, following a passage that had been recently opened by seismic activity. The walls here were smooth, almost polished looking, like they'd been shaped deliberately instead of naturally formed. Palmer was excited about this. He said it might be evidence of human activity from centuries ago, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we shouldn't be here. That's when we found them, footprints. They were pressed into the mud along one side of the tunnel. Perfectly preserved prints that looked fresh enough to have been made minutes ago. But there was no one else down here except us, and these prints were too large and misshapen to belong to any human I'd ever seen. They had long toes that curled slightly at the ends, almost like claws. Palmer crouched down to inspect them, while one of the researchers took photos. "These don't make sense," Palmer muttered under his breath. "The mud here hasn't been disturbed in decades." I didn't say anything, but my gut told me something was wrong. We pressed on cautiously, our nerves stretched thin as we entered a larger chamber where sound seemed to bounce off every surface in strange ways. Palmer set up his recording equipment, while we waited in uneasy silence. When he played back what he'd recorded, none of us spoke for a long time. The audio started with normal sounds, our footsteps and breathing, but then came something else. Voices. They were faint at first, almost hidden beneath static, but as Palmer adjusted the playback settings, they grew louder and clearer. "Bill," it was my name. I felt my blood run cold as I stared at Palmer's equipment, unable to tear my eyes away from it. The voice sounded familiar, too familiar, but I couldn't place it. "Let's pack up," I said quickly, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to stay calm. But deep down, I knew we wouldn't leave. Not yet. We didn't leave. I wanted to, but Palmer insisted we stay and investigate further. He said the voices on the recording could be an acoustic anomaly, maybe caused by the limestone formations. The researchers agreed with him, eager to collect more data. I didn't like it, but I couldn't argue with them, not without sounding like I was scared, so we pressed on. The deeper we went, the stranger things became. The tapping sounds grew louder, echoing through the tunnels like a heartbeat. Sometimes they seemed to come from right behind us, but when we turned around, there was nothing there. Other times they sounded far away, like they were leading us somewhere. Palmer kept stopping to listen, his head tilted like he was trying to catch something just out of reach. "Do you hear it?" he asked me at one point. "It sips almost like words." I shook my head, pretending I didn't hear anything. But I did. The tapping wasn't random anymore. It had a rhythm, a pattern that felt deliberate, and every time I listened closely, it made my chest tighten, like the walls were closing in around me. Then came the shadows. At first, I thought it was just our headlamps playing tricks on us. The limestone walls were uneven, creating strange shapes when the light hit them just right. But as we moved deeper into the cave system, The shadows started to move, sliding along the walls and ceilings in ways that didn't make sense. They weren't connected to us or our lights, they had their own movement, their own purpose. Palmer noticed them too. "It's just your eyes adjusting," he said when one of the researchers pointed them out, but his voice didn't sound convinced. By the third day underground, things took a turn for the worse. We found another chamber, a massive one with high ceilings and jagged formations that looked almost like teeth. The air here was colder than anywhere else we'd been, and it smelled faintly of rot. In the center of the chamber was something none of us could explain, a cluster of human-like figures carved into the rock itself. They weren't statues or fossils. They were part of the cave walls, their faces twisted in expressions of fear and agony. Their arms reached out as if they were trying to escape, but their bodies were fused with the stone. Palmer stared at them for a long time before whispering, "They look alive." I didn't want to stay in that chamber any longer than we had to, but as we turned to leave, one of the researchers froze in place. "Did you hear that?" she asked. We all stopped and listened. Sarah. It was her name this time, spoken softly but clearly from somewhere deep in the tunnel ahead of us. She looked at me with wide eyes, her face pale as a sheet. "I think it Sep's my mom," she whispered. I grabbed her arm before she could move toward the sound. "It's Sep's not your mom," I said firmly. "Whatever sits down here is trying to mess with us." But she wouldn't listen. She broke free from my grip and ran ahead into the darkness before any of us could stop her. We chased after her, shouting her name as our voices echoed wildly off the walls. The tunnel twisted and turned until we reached another chamber, a smaller one this time, with water pooling on the floor and stalactites dripping from above. Sarah was standing in the middle of it, staring at something none of us could see. "Sarah!" Palmer shouted as he ran toward her. She turned slowly to look at us, and that's when I saw her face. Her eyes were wide and blank, like she wasn't really seeing us anymore. Her lips moved silently as if she were talking to someone who wasn't there. Palmer grabbed her shoulders and shook her hard, but she didn't react, not until a shadow slid across the wall behind her. Then she screamed, a blood-curdling sound that echoed through every tunnel around us, and collapsed to the ground. Palmer carried her back while I led the way out of that chamber as fast as I could manage, with my limp slowing me down. Sarah wouldn't speak after that. She just stared ahead blankly, like she'd seen something none of us could understand. I wanted to leave right then and there to get everyone out before things got worse, but Palmer insisted we keep going. He said we were close to discovering something important. I didn't know what he meant by important. All I knew was that whatever was down here wasn't going to let us leave easily. By the fourth day, I could feel the weight of the cave pressing down on me. The air seemed heavier, harder to breathe, and every sound felt sharper, like it was cutting straight into my nerves. Sarah still hadn't spoken a word. She just followed us like a ghost, her eyes empty and distant. Palmer was more determined than ever to keep going, but even he was starting to look worn down. The researchers whispered among themselves, their faces pale and drawn. No one wanted to admit it out loud, but we all knew something was wrong, terribly wrong. We came across another passage that seemed newly opened by a recent tremor. The walls were smooth and damp, glistening in the light of our headlamps. Palmer insisted we explore it, saying it might lead to something significant. I didn't want to go in. It felt wrong, like the tunnel itself was watching us, but I couldn't leave the team behind. As we moved deeper into the new passage, the tapping sounds returned, louder and more erratic than before. They echoed all around us, coming from every direction at once. My heart pounded in my chest as I gripped my safety lamp tighter. The walls seemed to close in, narrowing until we had to crouch to keep moving forward. And then we found it. The passage opened up into a massive chamber, unlike anything I'd ever seen. The ceiling was so high our lights couldn't reach it, and the walls were lined with strange formations that looked almost human, faces and bodies twisted into grotesque shapes, their mouths open in silent screams. In the center of the chamber was a pool of water so still it looked like glass. But what caught my attention most were the remains. Dozens, maybe hundreds, of calcified human skeletons were arranged in concentric circles around the pool. Their bones were fused with the rock, their skulls tilted upward as if they'd been frozen in place while looking at something above them. The sight made my stomach churn, and I had to fight the urge to turn back and run. "What? What is this?" one of the researchers whispered, her voice trembling. Palmer didn't answer. He was too busy setting up his recording equipment near the pool, his hands shaking slightly as he adjusted the controls. "This is incredible," he muttered under his breath. "It seems like they were drawn here, like they were worshipping something. I didn't care what it was. I just wanted to get out of there." "We seen enough," I said firmly. "We you're leaving now." But before anyone could respond, the tapping started again, louder than ever. Tap, tap, tap. It echoed through the chamber like a drumbeat, growing faster and more frantic with each passing second. The shadows on the walls began to move again, sliding across the stone like living things, and then I saw them, the creatures. They emerged from cracks in the walls and ceiling, their gaunt bodies twisting unnaturally as they squeezed through impossibly narrow spaces. They had no eyes, just smooth patches of skin where their sockets should have been. Their ears were long and pointed, twitching constantly as if they could hear every sound we made. Their translucent skin stretched tightly over their bones, making them look more like walking corpses than living beings. One of them let out a low clicking sound that echoed through the chamber, and then they all turned toward us at once. "Run!" I shouted, my voice cracking as fear surged through me. We bolted for the passage we'd come through, but before we could reach it, one of the creatures dropped from the ceiling and landed in front of us with a sickening thud. It let out a guttural screech that made my ears ring and lunged toward Palmer. He screamed as its claw-like hands grabbed him, dragging him toward the pool in the center of the chamber. The rest of us froze in terror, until Sarah suddenly spoke for the first time since her breakdown. "They want us to stay," she said softly, her voice eerily calm. I grabbed her arm and pulled her toward me as another creature appeared behind us. "Not today," I muttered under my breath. Thinking fast, I reached into my pack and pulled out one of our metal water canisters. Using a rock from the ground, I pounded on it as hard as I could, creating a loud clanging noise that echoed wildly through the chamber. The creatures recoiled instantly, their long ears twitching violently as if the sound caused them pain. Palmer took advantage of their distraction to break free from his attacker and stumbled back toward us. "Keep making noise," I shouted as I handed canisters to everyone else. We banged on them relentlessly as we made our way back toward the passageway. The creatures followed us closely, their movements jerky and unnatural as they tried to block our path at every turn. But every time we made noise, they flinched and backed away just enough for us to slip past them. By the time we reached a narrower tunnel leading out of the chamber, Palmer stopped suddenly and turned back toward us with tears streaming down his face. "I said I'll hold them off," he said quietly. Before any of us could stop him or argue, he ran back into the chamber with one of our canisters in hand and started banging on it as loudly as he could. The creatures swarmed him instantly, but his sacrifice gave us just enough time to escape through the tunnel. The passage was tight, so tight I thought I might get stuck, but adrenaline pushed me forward until we finally emerged into an area we recognized from earlier in our descent. We didn't stop running until we reached daylight again. When we finally stepped out of the cave into the sunlight, I felt like I could breathe again. The cool air hit my face, and for a moment, I thought we were safe. But the relief didn't last. Palmer hadn't made it out, and the weight of what we'd just seen hung heavy over all of us. Sarah was trembling, her hands clutching her arms as if she was trying to hold herself together. The researchers looked pale and shaken, their equipment abandoned somewhere in the chaos. I wanted to say something to comfort them, but the truth was, I didn't have any words. What could I possibly say? That everything would be fine, that we'd forget about what happened down there? No one would ever forget. We sat in silence for a while, catching our breath and trying to process what we'd just escaped from. My ears were still ringing from the noise we'd made to fend off those creatures, but even through the ringing, I could feel something else, a faint vibration in the ground beneath me. I looked back at the cave entrance, half expecting to see one of those eyeless creatures crawling out after us. But there was nothing, Just the dark mouth of the tunnel staring back at me like it was daring me to come back inside. "Bill," Sarah whispered suddenly. I turned to her, startled by the sound of her voice. She hadn't said much since we'd escaped, but now she was staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "They're still down there," she said quietly. "And they're waiting." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. She was right. I could feel it too. The hollow ones weren't gone. They were just biding their time, waiting for someone else to wander too deep into their territory. The researchers packed up what little they had left and started heading back toward the ranger station. Sarah followed them without a word, her steps slow and unsteady like she was walking in a dream. I stayed behind for a few minutes longer, staring at the cave entrance and gripping my safety lamp tightly. My hearing wasn't right anymore. Everything sounded muffled, like I was underwater, but as I stood there in the silence, I felt something strange. It wasn't a sound exactly, it was more like a vibration running through the rock beneath my feet. And then it formed words. "Bill, come back." I froze, my heart pounding as the vibrations grew stronger, repeating the same phrase over and over again. "Come back, come back." I didn't move until one of the researchers called out to me from farther up the trail. "Bill, are you coming?" I turned away from the cave without looking back and followed them up toward the station. My legs felt heavy with every step, like something was pulling me back toward the darkness. I don't know if I ever go into Mammoth Cave again. Maybe I quit this job and find something that doesn't involve tight spaces or underground tunnels. But even if I leave this place behind, I know one thing for sure. The hollow ones are still waiting and they'll never stop calling. My name is Marcus Osgood. I'm 42 years old and I've spent most of my life trying to outrun my past. A year ago, I left Florida and took a job as a park ranger in the boundary waters of Minnesota. It's about as far from home as I could get, cold, remote, and quiet. That's what I wanted. Quiet. You see, I lost my son David last summer. He drowned while we were out fishing. I was supposed to be watching him, but I got distracted for just a moment. That's all it took. One moment. He was only 8 years old. After that day, my life fell apart. My wife left me, and I couldn't bear to stay in Florida anymore. Everywhere I looked, I saw him, his favorite fishing spot, his bike leaning against the garage, his room still filled with toys he'd never play with again. So when the transfer offer came up, a ranger position in Minnesota, I took it without thinking twice. The boundary waters are nothing like Florida. It's a frozen wilderness up here, especially in the winter. The lakes are covered in ice, the trees are weighed down with snow, and the cold cuts through you like a knife. But maybe that's why I came here, to feel something else for a change, even if it's just the cold. I carry David's compass with me everywhere I go. It was his favorite thing. He loved pretending to be an explorer when we went camping. It's old and scratched up now, but it still works, most of the time. It's the only thing I have left of him that feels real. The people around here don't know much about me, and that's fine by me. They think I'm just another stoic ranger who keeps to himself, but they don't see the nights when I wake up drenched in sweat from nightmares or the way my hands shake when I think too much about that day on the boat. I thought this place would be a fresh start, a chance to leave everything behind. But some things don't stay buried for long. The boundary waters are like nowhere else I've ever been. It's a vast wilderness of frozen lakes, dense pine forests, and biting cold that doesn't let up. In the winter of 1961, the temperature dropped to record lows -42 degrees Fahrenheit. The locals said it was one of the worst cold snaps in history. Even the snow seemed heavier, thicker, like it wanted to bury everything alive. The ranger station where I work is about 50 miles from the nearest town. It's isolated, surrounded by nothing but snow and trees for miles. The radio barely works most days because of the weather, and when it does, all you hear are reports about Cold War paranoia. People are scared of spies sneaking across the border from Canada, scared of nuclear bombs, scared of everything. Even out here in the wilderness, you can feel that fear hanging in the air like frost on a window pane. But there's something else about this place, something older than politics or war. The Ojibwe people have lived here for generations, and their stories about the land are enough to make your skin crawl. They talk about spirits that come out during the coldest winters, hungry spirits that live in the ice and snow. They call them frost spirits. According to legend, they're drawn to places where grief and pain linger, feeding off people's sorrow like wolves circling a wounded deer. I didn't believe in any of that when I first got here. I figured it was just folklore. Stories meant to scare kids into staying close to home during blizzards. But now, I'm not so sure. There's something about this place that feels wrong, especially at night when the wind howls through the trees like it's alive. The cold presses down on you here, heavier than anywhere else I've been. It's not just the kind of cold that freezes your skin. It sinks into your bones and makes you feel like you'll never be warm again. And sometimes, when I'm out patrolling the frozen lakes or hiking through the woods alone, I swear I can feel something watching me. It started with small things. Things I couldn't explain but tried not to think too much about. One morning, while I was out checking the trails, I saw footprints in the snow. Bare footprints. They were small, like a child's, and they led straight to the middle of a frozen lake. But here's the strange part. They just stopped. No sign of anyone falling through the ice, no tracks leading back to shore, nothing. It was like whoever made them had disappeared into thin air. I told myself it was probably some kind of trick the wind played on the snow. That's what you do out here. You make excuses for things that don't make sense. But the excuses started wearing thin when more strange things happened. The animals were acting weird. Wolves, which usually roam this area in packs, seemed to vanish overnight. I didn't hear their howls anymore, and their tracks were nowhere to be found. Even the birds were silent, like they'd all flown south at once. The only sound left was the wind, and even that felt wrong. Then there were the ice fishing holes. People drill them into the lakes to catch fish during the winter. But I found some that had refrozen in perfect circles, smooth and glassy like giant eyes staring up at me from beneath the surface. It wasn't natural. Ice doesn't freeze like that. The temperature kept dropping lower and lower, breaking records every day. It got so cold that my breath froze instantly in front of me, hanging in the air like smoke before falling to the ground as tiny crystals. Even inside the ranger station with the fire going, I couldn't shake the chill. One night, while I was trying to get a weather update on the radio, I heard something that made my skin crawl. At first, it was just static, normal for this time of year. But then I heard whispers. They weren't in English. They sounded backwards somehow, like someone had taken words and twisted them into something unnatural. I tried to tell myself it was just interference, but deep down, I knew better. Something wasn't right here. Something was watching. Things got worse after the footprints and the whispers. At first, I thought I was just imagining things, that maybe the cold was messing with my head. But then I found the fishermen. There were two of them, regulars who came out every winter to fish on one of the larger lakes. Their cabin was tucked away in the woods, about 10 miles from the ranger station. When I arrived, I could tell something was off right away. The door was wide open, snow had drifted inside, and there wasn't a single sound, not even the creak of the wind against the trees. Inside the cabin, I found them sitting at their table. They were frozen solid, like statues made of ice. Their faces were twisted in terror, mouths open as if they'd been screaming. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned chairs, no broken windows, but their bodies were colder than anything I'd ever felt, even colder than the air outside. I radioed for help, but the signal was weak, and all I got back was static mixed with faint whispers again. I decided to head back to the station and report it in person later, but as I left the cabin, I noticed something strange on the lake nearby. Blue lights, soft and flickering, danced across the ice like fireflies. I tried to approach them, but my compass went haywire, spinning wildly in circles no matter which direction I turned. That's when I remembered what David used to say about his compass. It always knows where you're supposed to go, but now it felt like it was warning me to stay away. The lights disappeared as quickly as they'd appeared, leaving me alone in the dark. On my way back to the station, I noticed carvings on some of the old trees near the trail, symbols etched deep into their bark. They looked ancient, like something you'd see in a museum or an old history book. The shapes reminded me of thin figures with hollow eyes staring out at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me as I walked back through the woods that night. Every time I stopped to listen, all I heard was silence. No animals, no wind, nothing. Just silence, so heavy it felt like it was pressing down on me. That night at the station, as I sat by the fire trying to warm up, my compass started spinning again on its own. I didn't want to believe it at first. I told myself the cold, the isolation, it was all playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. And then I saw them. It was late one night, just after midnight. I was out checking the trails near one of the smaller lakes when I saw movement on the ice. At first I thought it was just shadows, maybe the moonlight reflecting off the snow, but then I realized it wasn't shadows at all. It was something else. They were tall and thin, almost skeletal, with pale skin that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. Their bodies were so translucent that I could see what looked like crystalline shapes inside them, organs made of ice, glittering as they moved. They didn't walk like normal people. They glided across the ice, smooth and silent, as if their feet never touched the ground. The cold around them was unbearable. Even from a distance, I could feel it biting into my skin like needles. My breath froze instantly, hanging in the air before falling to the ground in tiny shards. They didn't speak. Not in words, anyway. But the sound they made was worse than anything I've ever heard. It was like ice cracking under pressure, sharp and jagged, mixed with faint whispers that seemed to come from everywhere at once. And then they did something that made my blood run colder than the air around me. They mimicked voices. Human voices. One of them called out in a voice that sounded eerily familiar, like David's voice. "Help me," it said, soft and broken, like he was crying. I froze where I stood, unable to move or even breathe. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst right out of my chest. The creatures didn't come closer. They just stood there on the ice, watching me with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. That's when I realized these weren't just strange animals or spirits from old legends. These were something far worse, something unnatural. The first time I came face to face with one of them, it was like stepping into a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. It happened during a routine patrol. Elliot Webster, the junior ranger who worked with me, had reported seeing strange lights near one of the larger lakes. I didn't want to go, but duty is duty, and I wasn't about to let him handle it alone. We headed out just before dusk, bundled up against the cold that seemed to grow sharper by the minute. The lights were there, just like Elliot said, blue and flickering, dancing across the ice like tiny flames. We decided to split up to cover more ground. It was a bad idea. Not long after we separated, a sudden whiteout swept through the area. The snow came down so thick I could barely see my own hands in front of me. The wind howled like a living thing, drowning out every sound except for one, Elliot's voice. "Marcus," he shouted from somewhere ahead. I stumbled forward, my boots crunching through the snow as I followed his voice. I stepped stuck. "Please." I finally saw him, or at least I thought it was him. He was kneeling near the edge of the lake, half submerged in the ice. His arms were stretched out toward me, his face pale and desperate. "Help me," he whispered again, his voice trembling, but something wasn't right. The closer I got, the more I realized his movements were off, too smooth, too deliberate, like he wasn't struggling at all. And then he looked up at me and smiled. It wasn't Elliot's smile. It was wide and unnatural, revealing crystalline teeth that glittered like shards of broken glass. His eyes weren't human anymore. They were hollow and cold, staring right through me. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat as the thing pretending to be Elliot began to rise from the ice. Its movements were slow and fluid, its translucent skin glowing faintly in the storm. I ran. I didn't look back. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in over my head. Whatever those things were, they weren't human, and they weren't just passing through, they were here for a reason. Back at the ranger station, I locked the doors and started digging through old records. I needed answers, something to explain what I'd seen. Among the dusty maps and faded logbooks, I found a journal left behind by a fur trapper who had worked in the area back in 1910. His handwriting was shaky, almost frantic, as he described an encounter eerily similar to mine. The trapper wrote about figures gliding across frozen lakes, their hollow eyes watching him from the shadows. He called them the Cold Ones and claimed they were drawn to sorrow, to people carrying heavy grief or guilt. He said they fed on it, growing stronger with every ounce of pain they consumed. I started piecing things together. Every 17 years, like clockwork, there were reports of strange deaths in the Boundary Waters, people found frozen solid, their faces twisted in terror. The pattern stretched back to 1876, and now it was happening again. The trapper's journal also mentioned carvings on trees, warnings left by the Ojibwe people long before settlers arrived. I remembered seeing those symbols on my patrols, thin figures with empty eyes etched into the bark of ancient pines. They weren't just decorations, they were warnings. Then it hit me, my grief over David's death wasn't just a weight I carried, it was a beacon. These creatures were drawn to me because of it. My guilt had made me a target. I stared at David's compass on the table in front of me as it spun slowly on its own. It felt like it was pointing towards something I wasn't sure I wanted to find. A few days later, a family showed up at the park. I couldn't believe it. Who in their right mind would bring kids out here during one of the coldest winters on record? The father, mother, and 2 kids, a boy around 8 and a teenage girl, had driven up in an old station wagon, completely ignoring the warnings posted at the entrance about dangerous weather conditions. I tried to convince them to leave. "It's not safe here," I said, doing my best to sound firm. "The cold sip's breaking records, and the snowstorms can come out of nowhere. You don't want to be stuck out here." But the father just waved me off. "We still be fine," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I didn't push further. People like that rarely listen, but something about them made my stomach twist. The way the father's hands shook when he talked, or how the boy kept staring at me like he could see right through me. That night I saw them again. Or at least I thought I did. Blue lights flickered near their campsite, and shadows moved between the trees. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out to check on them, but by the time I got there, everything was quiet. The fire was out, and their tent stood still in the snow. The next morning, things took a darker turn. The boy came running to the ranger station, his face pale and his breath coming in sharp gasps. "They sepper here," he whispered, clutching his jacket tightly around him. "They sepper watching us." I followed him back to the campsite, but nothing looked out of place at first. Then I noticed the father sitting by the frozen stream nearby. His skin had turned pale, almost translucent, and his movements were slow and jerky, like a puppet on strings. When I tried to talk to him, he didn't respond. He just stared at me with hollow eyes that seemed far too familiar. The boy tugged on my sleeve and pointed toward the stream. "Don't let him touch you," he whispered. I realized then that whatever was happening wasn't just about me anymore. The Cold Ones were targeting this family, and they were using my guilt as bait. Everything fell apart that night. I was back at the ranger station trying to figure out what to do about the family when I heard screaming outside. It was the boy. I grabbed my coat and flashlight and ran toward their campsite. The snow was coming down hard, and the wind made it nearly impossible to see. When I got there, I saw the father standing by the frozen stream, holding his son by the collar of his jacket. The boy was struggling, kicking and crying, but the father didn't seem to notice. His skin had turned almost completely translucent, and his breath came out in short bursts of freezing mist. He was trying to push the boy into the icy water. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice barely carrying over the storm. I ran toward them, but as I got closer, the father turned to look at me, and it wasn't him anymore. His eyes were hollow and cold, just like the creatures, and his mouth twisted into a grin that made my stomach drop. The mother was nowhere to be seen. I didn't have time to think about what might have happened to her. I had to save the boy. I lunged forward and grabbed him, pulling him away from his father's grip. The man, or whatever he had become, let out a sound that was somewhere between a scream and ice cracking. He stumbled backward into the stream, his body sinking slowly into the freezing water until only his hollow eyes remained visible above the surface. I carried the boy back to the ranger station, his small body shaking against mine as he sobbed into my shoulder. When we got inside, I locked every door and window and pushed furniture against them for good measure. But it didn't matter. The cold ones were already there. They surrounded the station, their tall, thin figures barely visible through the snowstorm outside. The temperature inside dropped so fast I could see frost forming on the walls and windows. The fire in the hearth sputtered and died, leaving us in complete darkness except for my flashlight. The boy pointed at one of the frosted windows and whispered, "They're here." He traced shapes in the frost with his finger, thin figures with hollow eyes. I knew we couldn't stay here much longer. I knew we had to do something. The cold ones weren't going to stop. They wanted us frozen, trapped in our own fear. The boy sat huddled near the fireplace, clutching his knees to his chest, while I rummaged through the supply closet for anything we could use. That's when I remembered something from the trapper's journal. They feared heat. Fire was their weakness, but ordinary flames froze near them. I needed something stronger, something that could burn even in this unnatural cold. I found a box of chemical heat packs and a bottle of alcohol in the emergency supplies. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. I wrapped the heat packs around rags soaked in alcohol and tied them to sticks, improvising crude Molotov cocktails. The boy watched me silently, his wide eyes following every move I made. "What are you going to do?" he asked in a small voice. "I'm going to end this," I said, though my hands were shaking as I spoke. The compass, the one that had belonged to David, was still spinning wildly on the table. It felt like it was trying to tell me something, pointing toward the lake where I'd first seen the creatures. I grabbed it and tucked it into my pocket, knowing it might be my only guide out there. I told the boy to stay inside no matter what happened and barricaded him in with everything I could find. Then I stepped outside into the freezing storm. The cold ones were everywhere, gliding across the snow, their hollow eyes fixed on me. The cold was so intense it felt like knives slicing through my skin, but I kept moving toward the lake. My compass spun faster as I got closer, leading me to a spot where the ice seemed thinner than the rest. That's when I saw her. The Frost Mother. She was larger than the others, her translucent body glowing faintly beneath the ice. Her hollow eyes stared up at me, and her presence made the air around me feel like it was suffocating. I lit one of my makeshift fire bombs and smashed it against the ice, cracking it open. Without thinking twice, I dove into the freezing water with the remaining bombs clutched in my hands. The cold swallowed me whole, but before everything went dark, I saw her shatter, her crystalline body breaking apart as fire consumed her. I don't remember what happened after I dove into the lake. The cold was too much. It numbed everything, even my thoughts. But when I woke up, I wasn't in the water. I was lying on the shore, the boy shaking me awake. "They're gone," he whispered, his voice trembling. I looked around. The cold ones had disappeared, and the storm had finally stopped. The air felt lighter, almost warm compared to before. The ice on the lake had started to crack and melt, leaving jagged shards floating in the water like broken glass. We walked back to the ranger station together, the boy holding my hand tightly as if afraid I might vanish like his father had. When we got there, he placed his own compass, the one he'd carried with him since they arrived, on the table next to mine. "You saved us," he said softly. The search party arrived a few days later. They found the mother alive but shaken, wandering near the edge of the forest. The father, he didn't come back. Whatever had taken him was gone now, but it had left its mark. As spring came and the ice began to thaw completely, I visited the lake one last time. For just a moment, I thought I saw something beneath the surface, a faint hand-shaped impression pressed against the ice before it melted away. The cold ones were gone for now, but I knew better than to think it was over. Some things don't stay buried for long.